In the latest episode of our podcast, Into the Killing, we discussed the 1969 murder of 23-year-old Jane Mixer. Mixer was a law student at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. When she was murdered, a serial killer was preying on young women in the area. Was Jane Mixer one of his victims, or was she killed by a possible copycat? You can find Into the Killing on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and anywhere you find great podcasts. Before we start today's video, we want to bring you a word from our amazing sponsor, June's Journey. June's Journey is an incredibly fun and engaging, free to download hidden object game. I have so much fun when I'm playing it, and I'm not the only one. June's Journey has over 30 million fans worldwide. One thing I absolutely love about the game is the storyline. It takes place in the roaring 1920s, and the protagonist, June Parker, is trying to solve the murder of her sister and uncover her family's darkest secrets. The game has beautifully rendered settings where you find hidden objects. I find it's the perfect game to play when I'm lounging around watching TV at the end of the day. It may be the perfect game for you to play while you're watching a true crime channel on YouTube, but I'll warn you, it's addictive. I always find myself saying, just one more game, and the next thing I know, an hour's gone by. Download June's Journey for free by clicking on the link in the description. June's Journey is available on Android and iOS mobile devices, as well as on PC through Facebook Games. When you download June's Journey, you'll not only be getting a great hidden object game, but you'll also be supporting Criminally Listed. So download June's Journey for free today. Number 3. Barbara May Tucker. In early 1980, 19-year-old Barbara May Tucker was attending Mount Hood Community College in Gresham, Oregon. Tucker was a sophomore in the business management school. After school, she wanted to work in retail. Tucker grew up in Portland, Oregon, which is about 20 miles from the college campus. She was the youngest of 7 children. On January 15, 1980, Barbara Tucker had a night class. That night, several motorists driving by the campus saw a young woman run out of a wooded area on the campus. She ran out into the middle of the road while waving her arms. It appeared that she was trying to get a car to stop. At least one person thought she had blood and mud on her face. Several cars swerved to miss her, but no one stopped. A man emerged from the woods, grabbed her by the arm, and led her back into the woods. People said that they didn't stop because they thought it was a prank. The next morning, several students found the body of 18-year-old Barbara May Tucker in some shrubbery on campus. She had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death. The police didn't have any suspects, and it wasn't long before the case went cold. It would stay that way for over 4 decades. Then in early 2021, the DNA from the evidence was submitted to Parabon Nanolabs, which became internationally famous in 2018 for identifying Joseph James D'Angelo as the Golden State Killer. Parabon Nanolabs traced Barbara Tucker's killer's family tree to a 58-year-old man named Robert Plimpton. When Plimpton was identified as the killer, he was living in Troutdale, Oregon, which is about 2 miles from the Mount Hood Community College campus. Plimpton was only a 16-year-old high school student at the time of Barbara's murder. He went on to get married, and he had 2 children. Plimpton only had one major brush with the law. In 1997, a woman accused him of driving her to an isolated area where he attacked her. He was arrested, but the charges against him were ultimately dismissed due to a lack of evidence. Plimpton was arrested for Barbara Tucker's murder on June 21, 2021, over 41 years after her murder. Even though he was 16 when the murder was committed, he was charged as an adult. His trial date has yet to be set. Number 2. Stephanie Isaacson. At about 6:30 a.m. on June 1, 1989, 14-year-old Stephanie Isaacson set off for school alone. She lived with her father in Las Vegas, Nevada. Her father was a staff sergeant at Nellis Air Force Base. They had moved to Las Vegas 3 years earlier. In a month, they were going to relocate to Spain. On the afternoon of June 1st, Stephanie didn't come home. Her father called the school and learned that she didn't show up for school that day. He called her friends and no one had seen her. So he reported her missing. The police immediately started a search for her. The search ended in a tragic way that no one wanted. When Stephanie walked to school, she usually walked on a trail through a vacant sandlot as a shortcut. Her body was found about 25 feet from the trail that she usually walked on. She had been sexually assaulted and suffered severe blunt trauma wounds to the head. The cause of death was strangulation. It wasn't long before the case went cold. In 1998, the forensic team tested the evidence for DNA but couldn't find any. 9 years later, in 2007, the evidence was examined again with more sophisticated technology. This time, some DNA was found and a profile was created. It was entered into the FBI's combined DNA index system, also known as CODIS, but no match was found. Then in November 2020, a forensic genealogy company, Othram Incorporated, contacted the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. They said that a Las Vegas man had anonymously donated $5,000. He asked them to solve a Las Vegas cold case. Stephanie's case was suggested because very little DNA evidence was left. Usually for a genetic test like those used for 23andMe and Ancestry.com, 750 nanograms of DNA are used. With Stephanie's murder, only 12/10 of a nanogram were left. That is about 15 human cells. Amazingly, using that little DNA, Othram Incorporated developed a genetic profile, and then genetic genealogists filled out the family tree. In total, it took them 9 months. It led them to a man named Darren Roy Marchard, who was 23 at the time of Stephanie's murder. Stephanie's case set a new world record. It was the least amount of DNA used to solve a case. It was later revealed that the money was donated by Justin Wu, a Las Vegas-based entrepreneur. He is also the founder of the nonprofit organization Vegas Helps. Tragically, the murder of Stephanie Isaacson was not the only homicide that Marchand was connected to. On February 27, 1986, 3 years before Stephanie's murder, 25-year-old Nanette Vandenberg was found strangled to death in her bathtub in her Las Vegas apartment. Vandenberg was last seen with Marchand at a casino. Also, his fingerprints were found near her body. Marchand, who was 23 at the time, was arrested for the murder, but the case was dismissed due to a lack of evidence. DNA evidence from Vandenberg's murder had been stored and was compared to the DNA from Stephanie's case. It was a match. However, Darren Marchand would never face justice for the two murders. He took his own life in 1995 at the age of 29. Stephanie's father was thankful that the case was solved, but he was also angry. He said, "That son of a bitch got me twice, once when he killed my daughter, and the other when I didn't get the opportunity to look him in the eye." Number 1. Kimberly Dietz Livesey, Sia Demas, and Jennifer Good. On June 22, 2000, two people were traveling in a car in Cooper City, Florida. They noticed a suitcase on the side of the road and decided to pick it up. But they couldn't lift it because it was too heavy. When they opened the suitcase, they were shocked to find the nude, dead body of a woman. The medical examiner determined that the woman had been beaten to death. The body was identified as Kimberly Dietz-Livesey. Dietz-Livesey was married and the mother of a young daughter. However, she was estranged from her family because she was battling addictions to drugs and alcohol. Months before her murder, she moved from Fort Lauderdale to Miami, Florida to go to a rehabilitation center. But she left the center and got back into drugs and alcohol. To support her habits, she turned to sex work. The police thought that she was killed by one of her clients, but they didn't have any idea who he was. Less than 2 months later, on August 9, 2000, a woman was walking her dog in Dania Beach, Florida. Dania Beach is about 9 miles from Cooper City. The woman came across a duffel bag on the side of the road. Inside the duffel bag was the nude, dead body of a woman. Like Kimberly Dietz-Livesey, she had been beaten to death. The body was identified as 21-year-old Sia Demas. She was also a mother of one, and she struggled with addiction. She had recently been crashing in crack houses in nearby Fort Lauderdale with her young son. She was also a sex worker. The investigators in both cities immediately saw the connections between the two murders. Both women were sex workers with addiction problems who were beaten to death, and their bodies were stuffed into traveling cases. Their bodies were also dumped within 9 miles of each other. So while the police believed that they were both killed by the same person, they didn't know who that person was. It also appeared that he went quiet after the second murder. 1 year later, on August 30th, 2001, a woman's body was floating in Biscayne Bay in Miami. She had been stabbed multiple times. The body was identified as 24-year-old Jessica Good. Good struggled with addiction, and she was involved in sex work. This time, the police had a lead in the case. At the time of Good's murder, she had a boyfriend. The boyfriend told the police on the night that Good was murdered, she was meeting a man who drove a van. The boyfriend was able to find the man's phone number. It turned out that the phone number was for a business, and only one of its employees had access to the company van. That was 36-year-old Roberto Wagner Fernandez. The police talked to sex workers in Miami and Fort Lauderdale, and several of them were familiar with Fernandez. When the police went to question Fernandez, they couldn't find him. He had vanished. The police got into his apartment in Miami and found some DNA. The DNA was matched to DNA found under Jennifer Good's fingernails. It was assumed it was Roberto Wagner Fernandez's DNA, but the authorities couldn't say for sure. To be 100% certain, they needed to take a DNA sample directly from Fernandez. It turned out on September 1st, 2001, 2 days after Good's body was found, he fled back to his native Brazil. The police investigated Fernandez's background. He was born in April 1965 in Brazil. When he was an adult, he became a licensed pilot. Fernandez had some major problems when he lived in Brazil. He was the suspect in several violent crimes against sex workers. In 1996, Fernandez went to trial for the murder of his wife. He was found not guilty because he had supposedly acted in self-defense. His deceased wife's family was furious about the verdict. They supposedly hired hitmen to kill him. Over the next 3 years after Fernandez's acquittal, he made several trips back and forth between the United States and Brazil. In 1999, he got a driver's license in Florida and he settled in Miami. In Florida, he worked as a flight attendant and as a driver for a company that gave tours in Miami. After Fernandez fled to Brazil after Good's murder, the police in Florida lost track of him. 10 years later, in 2011, the murders of Kimberly Kalitzke and Sia Demas were reopened. DNA was tested, and it proved that they were both killed by the same man. A match was also found in their database. It was the DNA of the man who killed Jennifer Good, who was presumably Roberto Wagner Fernandez. The DNA matches led to a more extensive investigation that involved the Brazilian National Police, the U.S. Department of Justice, and the FBI. They learned that Fernandez was arrested in Brazil for rape in 2003, but it's unclear what the results of that arrest were. Then, in 2005, 40-year-old Roberto Wagner Fernandez was supposedly killed. But he wasn't killed by the assassins hired by his former wife's family. Instead, he allegedly died in Paraguay when the plane he was piloting crashed. The American authorities were not entirely convinced that Fernandez was actually dead. They thought he might have faked his own death. In October 2020, a judge ordered the remains of Fernandez's grave to be exhumed. In August 2021, the police in Florida announced that it was Fernandez's remains in the grave. They also confirmed that he was the serial killer who murdered Kimberly Kalitzke, Sia Demas, and Jennifer Good. The police suspect that Roberto Wagner Fernandez committed more murders in the United States, Brazil, and other countries in South America. They think it's highly possible that more murders will be connected to him via DNA in the future. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Don't forget to check out the latest episode of Into the Killing. It can be found on Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and anywhere you find great podcasts. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.